In 1836, Thomas Cole did a series of 5 paintings called The Course of the Empire. These paintings are huge. They're 65 inches across. And so if you can imagine 5 of these huge canvases kind of painted as if side by side they form a storyline, a storyboard of sorts, telling the story of the rise and fall of an empire. All 5 settings are the same place. And if you'll notice as we go through these paintings, you can always see in the background the rock on top of the mountain. Cole uses this rock, first of all, to let us orientate ourselves as the perspective shifts slightly, but also to give us an indication that we are looking at the same place. This is nature's permanence in the background, which stays no matter what. Now, the first painting is called The Savage State. If you look, you'll see a couple things. Human beings are represented by these kind of animal skin clad hunters and gatherers. In the foreground, you see a man with a bow and arrow, and he's shooting at a deer that runs across the river. In the background, we see 4 or 5 people that are involved in some kind of worship. And to the right, you see the very beginnings of buildings. In this case, a very stereotypical set of teepees with a fire in the middle. And so we really have a lot of the elements of civilization here in a pretty raw state. We have the relationship between man and animal as hunters and gatherers. We have a worship that's kind of a nature worship. We have the beginnings of architecture. And also on the far right, you see a boat, a canoe, going up the river. The second painting in the series is called The Pastoral State. You can tell that this is the same spot because once again in the background we see the hill with the little rock on it. But now some of the things have changed. In this canvas, the hunter and gatherer, or the hunter shooting the deer, has been replaced by a man herding sheep. There's also on the left side of the painting a man drawing the symbol for infinity on the ground with a stick. In the middle of the painting, we see that the river, now dry, has a bridge that's gone over it, even though it's a pretty basic bridge. To the right, we see 2 women dancing to a man who's playing a flute. And in the background, we see a building, almost reminiscent of some Greek temple. And in the far left, we see a man pulling or having an ox pull plow as he plows the fields. And so in this second painting, the Arcadian, or sometimes called the Pastoral State, we see that man has started to control nature. Gone are a lot of the trees that populated the landscape before, and each element, the hunting animals for food becomes the herding animals for food, which represents a control of nature. The bridge over across the river, or where the river would be, represents controlling nature. The man having his fields plowed by a domesticated animal represents man controlling nature. And the architecture is also more developed. And so in the second painting, we see that man has started to control his landscape. The third painting is the most striking. This is called Consummation, which means the realization of something, or something at its height. The landscape in this case is almost unrecognizable when compared to the previous 2. We see a huge Roman kind of neoclassical buildings. The rough building, the round architecture of the previous building, the pastoral building, is now echoed in these domed with pillar buildings. We have the goddess Athena, who represents wisdom and beauty, up on a huge pillar, or set of pillars. As you see, this is typical. All of these paintings so far have been typical romantic age landscapes, in the sense that the people are very small. But unlike the Savage State, and even unlike the Pastoral State, in this painting called Consummation, man has really controlled nature. A couple things. You'll notice these potted plants. So this is to represent the consummation of man controlling the potted plants. We saw the savage state had uncontrolled landscape in terms of trees. The pastoral state, in addition to man starting to farm, we also had a lot of the grass that had been growing and trees that had been cut down. And here, in the consummation, nature is kept neat and tidy in human-made pots. We also have the river being used for transportation. Okay, so the river is now bridged in a way that's much more elaborate, but it also continues the trend from no bridge to rough bridge to, in this case, very elaborate and architecturally stunning bridges. And so if this were where the series ended, we would say that this was an Age of Reason painting or series of paintings. Because at this point, what Cole seems to be celebrating, although he isn't, as we'll find out, but what he seems to be celebrating is the awesomeness of man and his ability to control nature through his use of wisdom and logic and reason and technology. In the next painting, a painting called Destruction, things take a turn for the worse. Here we have the same city as in Consummation, but it's crumbling. The bridge that used to go across the river is now falling apart. The ships of transports have been replaced by these triamine ships of war, and sometime between the last painting, Consummation, and this painting, Destruction, they've replaced the goddess of wisdom and beauty, Athena, with the god of war, Mars. In fact, it's not just the god of war, it's a headless god of war. And so all of the imagery that go with an unthinking worship of war and destruction. There's two sides. As you if you look closer, you'll see that this depicts a battle of sorts. There's a lot of fire. There's a lot of chaos in the water, and the sky even is getting angry. And so this is the crumbling of the beautiful civilization, because at some point, like all empires, this empire seems to have needed to work harder and harder to maintain its control, and now that control is slipping away. And in the final painting, Desolation, we see once again nature is taking control. It may seem like it would make sense for us to not have any landscape that's dominated by people, whereas in this painting, this pillar that's in the foreground still dominates our view. But I think the landscape that has this architecture is important because it's the remnants, and it reminds us that once here stood a great empire. But now nature is slowly taking over. At this point, what Cole seems to be saying to the Age of Reason thinkers is that, yeah, no doubt, the stuff that you're working with, it is powerful. So similar to the Dr. Heidegger's experiment, the scientists, or in Cole's case, the Age of Reason, can oftentimes accomplish what it means to accomplish. The problem isn't so much that it can't do it. The problem is that it can't do it forever in this case. And so here we are, back in nature, and over the next 100, 200, 400, 800 years, these buildings will continue to crumble until there's nothing left of the civilization that once stood.